They thought she was just passing through, a worn-out widow too quiet for a world that had already shouted her down. She had no kin, no coin, no destination, just a worn shawl, a trembling hand, and a kindness that wouldn't die even after everything else had. The townsfolk barely noticed her at the station, just another woman left behind by the world. But two little girls did. With hands sticky from apples and eyes too old for their years, they whispered the question that would change all four lives: will you be the mother our father needs? That was the moment the story took its first breath. What followed was not a tale of rescue, but of rebuilding. Not romance at first sight, but respect born in the silence between chores. Not a man who needed saving, but one who didn't know he could still be seen. And a woman, Mabel Keene, who had been told too many times she was too late, too plain, too broken. Learning that love doesn't come early or easy. It comes when it's ready. And when we are too. But what happened when the past returned? When the man's former love came back, demanding a place at the table, would Mabel step back or finally fight for a home of her own? Sometimes the softest women change the hardest men without ever raising their voice. Don't miss what happens next. Would you stay if they asked you the same question? Mabel Sutter had never seen the sky so wide nor the earth so empty beneath it. She walked with her hands folded tight against the apron she'd kept pressed to her for weeks now, ever since her husband's burial in Elk Hollow and the quiet eviction that followed 3 days later. The farm had never been hers, not legally, not really. Not in a county where a man's name was worth more than a woman's effort. She'd fed that land with her back and knees, raised pigs and pumpkins, and two sons who had long since gone to find their fortunes westward, and yet it was his land. So when death came, it left her with nothing but a name stitched on a Bible and a coat too big for her shoulders. Now she stood at the edge of a long road between nowhere and less than nowhere. Dry grass waved gently on the breeze as if bowing out of her way. The wagon that stopped wasn't hers, nor did she expect it to be kind. But the voice that called out a child's voice carried no cruelty, only curiosity. "Ma'am," the little girl said, hair the color of creek mud, eyes like polished stones. She sat beside another girl a bit older, both wrapped in quilts that had once been red, but were now dusty with time. Mabel managed a nod. "Our papa's looking for a cook," the older girl said carefully. "And we think maybe you're the one." Mabel's lips parted, but no sound came. "Will you come with us?" the younger one asked with the sincerity only children have. Just, just to cook. For now." Mabel hadn't been chosen in a long, long time. Not for anything. She stepped up into the wagon slowly, and the girls made room as if they'd always been waiting. The man at the reins said little. Just a nod. He didn't even look back at her as the wheels turned. But the girls did, and they smiled. What kind of man was waiting at the end of that trail? And why did the girls choose her, not anyone else, for such a quiet but sacred role? The ride to the ranch was long enough for silence to settle, but not long enough for Mabel's heart to settle with it. She sat stiff on the buckboard seat beside the two girls, Ellie and June. They'd introduced themselves, while the man driving the team said not a word. He wore a hat pulled low and a coat too big in the shoulders. She caught only glimpses of his face in profile, a jaw set like stone, a cheekbone hollowed by grief or work, maybe both. They didn't stop to speak, only to water the horses. He moved with quiet efficiency, like someone who'd done things alone for far too long. She recognized that rhythm. She had worn it herself. "His name is Levi Dalton," whispered Ellie, the younger one, as they passed a grove of brittle trees. "He don't like to talk much. Not since Mama." June elbowed her gently. "Don't go telling everything." "She's not everything," Ellie whispered back. "She's just here to help." Mabel offered a soft smile and didn't press. She'd learned long ago that questions were rarely welcomed where wounds still leaked beneath the skin. When they arrived, the ranch was more bones than flesh. A house, yes, but leaning. A barn, but sagging. Fences broken. Chickens that looked confused by their own freedom. Still it stood, and somehow standing meant it hadn't given up. Levi helped her down from the wagon, finally meeting her eyes for the first time. His voice came out like it hadn't been used in weeks. "You're here to cook. That's it. You don't owe nobody nothing, and I don't owe you either. It wasn't cruel, just matter of fact. Just hollow. She nodded. I can cook. He turned and walked toward the house. The girls ran ahead of them, calling out which room she'd stay in the back garden that still had onions and a cat who didn't belong to anyone but came around like he did. Inside the kitchen was dusty, the hearth cold, but the bones were good, like the ranch, like Levi. That night, Mabel washed the pans with water she had to boil herself and roasted potatoes that were more sprout than starch. But when she served them, the girls said thank you with full mouths and grateful eyes. Levi said nothing, but he took seconds. What wounds was Levi carrying behind that silence? And could Mabel's quiet dignity reach what words could not? The days passed the way seasons do in places where grief hangs like fog, gradually, imperceptibly, and then all at once. Mabel rose before the girls stirred the ashes in the hearth until warmth returned and set to work making bread from what little flour there was. She stretched meals like she used to stretch hope, thin but enough. The girls began bringing her wild herbs from the edge of the creek and eggs laid in odd corners of the barn. Slowly, the kitchen stopped smelling like dust and began to smell like home. But Levi remained a man of winter. He spoke only when needed, barely looked her in the eye, and disappeared for hours into the fields. Some days he didn't come back until long after supper, boots caked in mud shoulders, sagging under burdens no one named. The house might have been full of children's laughter and the aroma of stew, but he walked through it like a ghost too stubborn to rest. One afternoon, Mabel found herself in the garden sleeves, rolled pulling weeds from a patch that had once grown tomatoes. The sun was warm but not kind, and her back ached in that way that reminded her she wasn't 30 anymore. I didn't ask you to do that, came his voice behind her. She didn't look up. Didn't do it for you. Silence stretched again, taut like a rope between them. You're not here to fix things, he said finally. Now she did rise, brushing dirt from her apron, meeting him with steady eyes. Maybe not, but I won't live among things that are broken without trying. Levi looked at her like he was seeing her for the first time and didn't quite know what to do with the sight. She walked past him, then not in defiance, but in the way someone walks when they know their worth isn't up for debate. That night there was bread and onions roasted with vinegar and thyme, and for the first time Levi stayed at the table until the girls had finished giggling through their second helpings. He didn't speak, but he stayed, and Mabel noticed. Sometimes it's not cruelty that builds walls, it's sorrow. But what happens when someone begins planting seeds along those walls, hoping they bloom? The house had a back room no one spoke of. It was kept shut tight with a key that hung above the stove untouched. The girls once whispered it had belonged to their mother, and though Mabel never pried, she felt the sorrow that clung to its frame each time she passed it. Weeks had softened the silence between her and Levi. He still wore grief like an old coat, but he no longer vanished into it. Sometimes he paused at the kitchen door while Mabel kneaded dough or peeled potatoes, saying nothing but standing long enough to be noticed. Other times he'd bring in a splintered crate of apples or carry in wood without being asked. He never stayed long, but the stillness between them had warmed like frost melting off a window pane. One evening after the girls had fallen asleep, curled against each other like kittens, Mabel sat alone by the fire stitching a tear in one of Levi's shirts. He entered quietly, as he often did now, holding something in his hand, a small tin box. I reckon it's time, he said, voice low. He handed her the box and gestured toward the back room. Mabel looked up. You sure? He only nodded, but his eyes were glassy. She followed him to the door. He took the key from above the stove, his hand trembling slightly, and unlocked the room. The scent of rose water lingered faintly in the air, mixed with dust and thyme. A dress still hung on a hook. A child's drawing had yellowed on the wall, and there on the dresser sat a locket and a hairbrush, untouched for years. She died in childbirth. Never got to hold our youngest Levi, said, eyes fixed ahead. I closed this door the day she passed. Mabel didn't touch anything. Instead, she placed the tin box gently on the dresser and stood beside him. After a long silence, she asked softly, and what now? He looked at her, tired and raw. Now I try to live with the door open. And just like that, something shifted. The house seemed to breathe for the first time in years. Not with joy yet, but with possibility. Some rooms stay closed too long, but healing begins not with forgetting, but with opening the door and letting in light. The days that followed the unlocking of the room felt different. Not louder, not brighter, just more awake. Levi still rose early, but now his boots paused just a little longer by the hearth. He still didn't speak much, but when he did, his words had softened. And though he never asked, Mabel noticed the girls had begun leaving small things for her: fresh-picked daisies on her pillow, a ribbon tied around her teacup, a lopsided drawing of a woman with wild hair holding their hands. But peace, Mabel knew, never settled without testing its footing. One afternoon, a woman rode up on a chestnut mare, tall, striking hair pinned tight beneath a burgundy bonnet. Her name was Miss Clara Bennick, and her voice carried the kind of sharp that could slice cloth. "I heard Levi took in a cook," she said, stepping down with elegance born of pride. "I came to see if the rumors were true." Mabel met her on the porch, wiping her hands on her apron. "I cook, yes." Clara's smile didn't reach her eyes. "That's all you do?" I imagine Mabel said nothing, but her silence was not surrender, it was rooted. Later she learned Clara had once been Levi's intended. They were never married, but grief had bound them oddly, and society expected what neither had pursued. Over supper, Levi's mood shifted. He barely ate, barely looked her way. When Clara dropped by again, this time with a pie and a possessive laugh, Mabel knew what the world might think, that Clara was more fitting for a man like him. The next morning, Mabel rose early, packed her satchel, and set it by the door. She didn't intend to leave, not yet, but she needed Levi to notice the weight of choice. That night, as she scrubbed the pot alone under lantern light, Levi finally spoke. "You think I'm sending you away?" She didn't turn. "I think I don't belong where I'm not seen." Silence stretched. Then softly, "You're the only one who ever looked into that room with me and didn't flinch." She turned. He was staring at her, not just looking, but seeing. "I flinched," she said, "but I stayed. Some love isn't loud. It just shows up, stays quiet, and stays present." But will that be enough? When ghosts from the past come knocking? It was Clara Bennick who brought the storm, but it wasn't the kind that broke fences or split trees. It was the kind that made a man doubt. Mabel saw it in Levi's eyes the next day. The way he looked past her, not at her. The way his hand hovered just above the table, unsure whether to reach for hers or not. Clara's presence on the ranch had stirred something that hadn't fully settled old expectations. Societal weight's the question of should rather than want. At supper, Susie and June picked at their beans. The usual chatter was gone, replaced by silence that pressed against the walls like unspoken prayers. Later that evening, Mabel found the two girls sitting on the back step, knees pulled to their chins. "Is Papa going to marry Miss Clara?" Susie asked, her voice barely more than wind. Mabel didn't answer. She couldn't. Not without lying. June slid her hand into Mabel's. "We don't want her. We want you." Tears blurred the evening. Mabel sat with them until the stars rose, her hands full of tiny fingers and unspoken hope. Inside the house, Levi stood in the doorway, watching the woman who had become his hearth without ever asking to be. And he made a choice. The next morning, Clara arrived again, dressed finer than before, holding a box of pastries. Levi met her on the porch. "Clara, you needn't come again." She blinked. "Excuse me, I know what people expect, but I've stopped letting expectation make decisions for me. Mabel is the one this house feels right with. She's the one my daughters look for in the dark." Clara stiffened. "You're throwing away everything we once were." "We never were, Clara. We just almost were." And then, for the first time, Levi turned fully toward Mabel, who had stepped out with her apron still dusted in flour. "Would you stay?" he asked, voice steady. "Not just for cooking, but for us." Mabel didn't answer right away. She looked at the girls watching through the window. She looked at the porch that had once been just a job and was now a place of becoming. And she said, "I already did. Some doors don't slam. They're simply never opened again. But when one closes softly, another life quietly begins." Mabel had never imagined a second chance could feel this quiet. There was no grand wedding, no white dress. Just a Sunday morning, the wood stove humming, Levi shaving carefully in front of a cracked mirror, and two girls braiding Mabel's hair with wildflowers they had picked at dawn. Susie and June had asked for it, not a wedding, but a promise. One that didn't need a preacher or guests, just four hearts willing to be steady. So they stood behind the house where the cottonwoods bowed gently in the breeze. Mabel wore her old blue skirt. Levi held her hand like it was something sacred, and the girls made a circle with rocks and petals, whispering the words they'd heard Mabel say to the fire each night. Warmth, kindness, stay. That was their vow. That was enough. Spring passed into summer. Clara Bennick eventually married a banker in town. She sent a note with cake. Mabel thanked her silently for the peace that comes when a chapter ends gently. The townsfolk stopped whispering. Some even smiled when Mabel passed by with the girls. One morning Levi came in from the fields, hat in hand, sun on his neck, and kissed Mabel on the cheek like it was the first time. Still shy, still certain. "You make this house breathe," he said. She didn't need to answer. The stew was bubbling. The floor swept. The girls laughing in the loft. And for the first time in a long time, Mabel turned the porch lantern off before sundown. She knew the ones who mattered were already home. Some women aren't rescued. They rescue the silence. They rescue the lost things. They rescue men too proud to ask for healing. Would you like to hear another story like Mabel's? Sometimes the people who arrive with the least in their hands leave behind the most in our hearts. Mabel didn't come to build a new life. She only came to rest a while, to be useful, maybe to matter quietly behind someone else's door. But through the small hands of two little girls, through a man who didn't know how to speak tenderness until he saw it, and through her own quiet courage stitched through each meal, each stitched sock, each kind word she gave away, Mabel didn't just find a home, she became one. And perhaps that's what love truly is in the later seasons of life. Not fireworks, not first glances, but the quiet unfolding of trust, the choice to stay, and the grace of being chosen in return. If this story moved you, dear friend, we hope you'll take a moment to reflect. Have you ever been someone's safe place without even knowing it? And if this journey warmed your heart, please subscribe to None, Wild West Saga, where stories like Mabel's continue to bloom. Share your thoughts in the comments. Would you like to see what comes next for this family, or more stories like this? Don't forget to like, share, and comment. Your kindness helps these quiet stories reach others who might need them most. See you on the next trail.